Bava Metzia Daf Chaf. We begin with the last Mishnah in the first parak of the Masechta. We'll hopefully get to the end of the parak, which is a few lines into the next daf. So the Mishnah is a lengthy Mishnah, gives a number of situations in which you find a document of sorts and whether you should return it or not. So first of all, it says we find a document of evaluation, that is, that a borrower wasn't able to pay back, and the Beis Din wrote a document evaluating his property as to how much it's worth. Next case is if you found a document in which a husband promises to support the daughters of his wife. Third is a shtar chalitza, recording that a chalitza was performed. Next is a shtar miyun. Miyun is a marriage d'Rabbanan. If a girl is married off by her brothers or by her mother in a situation where she doesn't have a father, and she's a ketano, the marriage is only d'Rabbanan. She can walk out of the marriage by just saying, I don't want it, in front of three people. It's recorded in a shtar called shtar miyun. Next is shtari birurin. The Gemara will explain that is either a shtar where the court records the tainas of two people when they come to say their shitas in front of the Beis. It's recorded in a shtar birurin. That the Gemara says is how we learned what shtar birurin means in Vavel, and Rabbi Yirmiyah says it means the shtar upon which two litigants choose who the judges will be. So the rule is zeh bar le'echad v'zeh bar le'echad. Each litigant chooses a dayan of his preference, and then those two dayanim together choose the third. So that document is the second opinion of shtar birurin. Next is v'chol ma'isa ve'ezin, anything which is made that a person needs to pay based on an instruction from the Rabbanan. All these things, if you find that shtar, you should return them all. You don't have to be afraid that they are paid or that any payment happens, because these aren't things that you pay. You also don't have to be afraid that they weren't used or that they're forged, because they were created in the Beis Din, and therefore the Beis Din knows that they're valid. Now, next set of halachos is if somebody finds a regular shtar, but he finds it in a container, a chafisa or deluskama. The Gemara explains that's either a case or a leather flask, a case that's used by old people to keep their possessions, their documents, or a flask. Next case is if you find a bunch of shtaros that are bundled up together, either in a tachrich or an aguda. The more explains the difference between those is that a tachrich is where you roll up a shtar, then you wrap another one around it and another one around it. And aguda is where you take three shtaros flat, you pile them up in a stack, and then you roll them up. So we'll see it's a minimum of three. The Gemara will discuss that later. So you can return all of these. These you are allowed to return as well. You return to the malveh. Now, what's the minimum? So here the Mishnah says it has to be three, tied it together. Now the next halacha said by Rosh ben Gamliel, he says if you have a situation in which you have three shtaros and one party is common to all three, such as three loan documents where three different people borrowed from the same malveh, or three loan documents in which three different people lent to the same lender. So you could assume that the one that's common to all three, that's the one who dropped it, because the odds of them all being together, if they were dropped from three separate individuals and they're not his, is highly unlikely. The Gemara will discuss some other possibilities that may have happened there. Now, that's Rosh Hashanah's first halacha. Rosh Hashanah's second halacha is if you find a shtar, you find a document between your papers, and you don't know what it's about. You find a loan document, Reuven lent money to Shimon, neither of them are yours. You don't know if it was given to you because it was paid, it wasn't paid, you're a raya, you were a shlish, what's happening with these? So the you keep it until Eliyahu comes, there's nothing you can do about it. Another case is if you find between your documents, you find a receipt that money that you lent was paid, you have to assume that loan really was paid, even though since you are the lender, you shouldn't be holding on to the receipt. The receipt should be by the borrower. You should have given it to him, but still you have to assume that it was paid because you have a document that says so. The Gemara explains Beruah, like we said before. Then the Gemara quotes an incident that happened, which we've seen earlier in the Masechta. So Gemara says that there was a get that was found in front of the Beis Din of Rav Huna, and it said on it that it was written for someone who lived in the town of Shiviri, which was on the river Rochis. So Rav Huna said, we have to be concerned that there's another Shviri out there that we're not aware of, and that this star was written for that person there, and therefore the one who lives here by that name, although we only know about one person who lives in Shviri by that name, he can't assume that it's his. You have to be afraid that it's someone else's, even though we don't know that such a city exists and that such a person exists. Rav Chisda said to Rabba, look into this, because in the evening Rav Huna is going to ask you what you think the halacha is. So he went and he looked and he found our Mishnah. It says any Maisa Vezin you could return. So that's all right, that you could return the get. It's a Maisa Vezin, you should therefore be allowed to return it. Now, if Amram asked Rabbah, how could you bring a raya from our Mishnah? Our Mishnah is talking about Mimayna, Hilchas Mamay. And this is a case of the get, which is Hilchas Isser. Maybe you can't bring a raya from Mamay to Isser. So he responded by calling him a tarda, an uncomplimentary term. And he said, what do you mean? The Mishnah has two cases of Isser. It has a case of a shtar chalitza and a shtar mian. So that was their exchange. And shortly after that, the main beam supporting the base medrash broke, and each one took responsibility. Rav, one said it's because I used an uncomplimentary term about a Talmud Chacham, therefore it's my fault. And the other one said it's because I asked a question that should not have been asked, therefore it's my fault that the beam broke there. Now the Gemara explains what a chafisa and a deluskim are, like we said before. And the Gemara goes into what is a tachrich when we say stars that are bound up to each other. How many stars does it have to be? The Gemara goes to Brisa that says it has to be 3. The Gemara says, though, this depends on what the siman is. Is the siman that it's tied up, and the fact that there's a knot, or the type of knot is the siman that people use to identify it, or is the siman the number of stars that there are here? So the Gemara says, if the siman is the knot, and this is a raya to one side of a shaylehem and the next parak of is the type of knot a siman or not? So Gemara says it could be that it's not a raya, because it could be that he's actually announcing, I found stars. He's not saying how many. And the person has to come and say how many. Or it could be that the person is just saying the fact that there are multiple stars that are bound up together, one around the other. Now, the Gemara says, if you're not mentioning the number, so why does it have to be 2? Then even, why does it have to be 3? Even if there are only 2, you should be able to say, I found shtaros, and the person will say that they were bound up. Now, if he has to say, if the siman is the number, then it has to be 3, because if it's less than 3, there's no siman. Because the fact that he said shtaros pretty much means 2, because 1 would be a shtar, and shtaros is 2. So in order for there to be a siman of a number, it has to be at least 3 or more, and then he specifies how much, and that's the siman. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to discuss the halachas of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. So first of all, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said if you find 3 shtaros together that are all the same loiva, same borrower, but different malvas, different lenders, so it must have fallen from the loiva, otherwise how do they all end up together? So it says maybe not. Maybe they fell from the court that he brought that they all brought them to be mekayim, meaning each malva separately brought them to the court to be mekayim, to establish that they are validated as far as the signatures, and they're lost from there. And that's why they're all together. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about where they were already pre-validated earlier in the shtar, and therefore you don't need it there. So it says, well, maybe it fell from the cipher, maybe from the person who wrote the shtaros for all 3. So it says, no, people pick up the shtar right away, they don't leave it there at all, and it couldn't be that it got lost from him. As soon as it was finished, they took it. Now, the second halacha was the inverse of this. If you find 3 different people who borrowed from the same malva, you could return it to the malva, because if it didn't fall from the malva, how did all 3 come together like this? So what does it mean? Maybe they fell from the cipher who wrote it. So where says, no, we're talking whether it was written by 3 different ciphers. You could tell from the ksav it was 3 different ciphers. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe it fell from the person that they brought it to be mekayim. Same question as before. So the Gemara answers, who brings the shtar to be mekayim? The malva. So if it was in the process of being mekayim and it got lost, it was the malva who brought it, so giving it to the malva anyway, which is exactly the halacha that we just said. The Gemara now moves on to talk about the final halacha in the Mishnah, which is that if you find a receipt between your documents, and you're not sure what it's for, even though you're the malva, the receipt has to be trusted, and if it says that a loan that you're holding on to the document was paid off, you can't collect it anymore. So Gemara brings a statement of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba named Rav, which seems to contradict this. Gemara just introduces that first. Rav says, if you have a receipt in the possession of the malva, ordinarily the malva writes the receipt and he gives it to the loiva when the loiva pays back the obligation, so the loiva can have proof that he paid already. So if a malva finds himself holding onto receipts and he's not sure what the story is, even if it's written in his own handwriting, you don't have to worry about it. It's puzzle, it's no good. Now, if it's written in the handwriting of a cipher, so it makes sense that he has it even though he didn't give it yet. And the reason is that he had a cipher write it for him because he wants to have it around. It's sometimes hard to find the cipher, and if the leiva is going to bring him the money and he's not going to have a receipt to give him, the leiva might walk. So therefore he will surmise that he found the cipher and he said, hey, write me a receipt so that I have one ready for when the leiva will come to repay. There it would be obvious, it would be simple to say that just because the receipt exists, since it's in the possession of the malva, don't assume that it's used. Rav says even if the malva wrote it himself and it's in his own handwriting, doesn't mean that it was used. It doesn't mean that the loan is actually repaid, because it makes sense that he wanted to write one early and he didn't use it yet. Why would he write one early if he could just write it himself whenever the malva shows up? He was afraid the malva will come near the end of the day, and he won't. If he has no receipt prepared, the malva is going to walk and he won't be able to give him a receipt. Therefore, he writes it early so that he could be prepared, so that he could have one ready to give him on the spot. So this is Rav's halacha. So when I ask this course, that our Mishnah seems to say otherwise. Our Mishnah says that you do trust the receipt and you assume that the receipt cancels the shtar. So it cancels the shtar chayv. It shows that the shtar chayv was already paid, the one that it refers to. So how does Rav explain that? So when it says you found it between your torn shtaris, it means you found it in a pile of torn up documents. Now Rashi brings two pshatim here. One pshat is that you found the loan document in a pile of torn documents, which indicates that it was thrown out and the loan was canceled, which supports the concept of the receipt that it was already paid off. Rashi's other pshat is that you found a receipt in the torn documents, and this shows that the malva had already torn it up, or he gave it to the leiva and he left it and it was torn up because the receipt is not needed anymore because it was paid off. The Gemara brings another eye against Rav. We have a Mishnah in Bava Metzia that says that if somebody finds a shtar that he lent money to Yosef ben Shimon, and there are two Yosef ben Shimons in the town. I don't know which one it is. And then he has two stars actually, one for each Yosef ben Shimon. But then he has a receipt that says that Yosef ben Shimon already paid up, but we don't know which Yosef ben Shimon it is. So the halacha is neither of them have to pay, because each one could claim he's the one that paid that receipt. So again, the kasha is that if he has his own receipt, Rav said that it's worth nothing, so they should both have to pay. So my answer is the same answer. Like Rav Safra said, you found it in the pile of torn shtaros, therefore we assume that it is cancelled. Umar has a third kasha with the same answer. In Masechah Shuas, we say that if Reuven lent money to Shimon and they both died, and now Reuven's children are trying to collect money from Shimon's children, so we make them swear. We make Reuven's children swear that the father did not pay, that the father did not receive payment for the loan, that the father did not tell them that he has a bikadin to pay off the loan, that he did not tell them, that he didn't say anything to show that it has not been paid yet. Amongst that, they also have to swear that they didn't find a receipt for the loan amongst their father's documents. Now the kasha is, we're talking about the malva, we're talking about Reuven. According to Rav, if there was a receipt amongst the documents of the malva, it would be worthless anyway. So again, the Gemara gives the same answer. Rav Safra says, and this is actually the first time that he said it, that it was found amongst the torn shtaris. Next, the Gemara brings this from a brisa that says, what happens if a malva finds a shtar amongst his materials, and he wants to claim that the loan was not paid off, he never used it, but the leiva claims that it was paid. So the brisa there says you should be mekayim the signatures of the witnesses on the shtar, which the Gemara understands to mean that if you can prove that the shtar is valid, because you can validate the signature, so you're not relying on the malva's words, then we can accept the shtar and say that the loan was paid already. If, however, we have to rely on the malva's words that the shtar, that this receipt is even valid, then we have to rely on his words that it wasn't used. But you do see, though, that if you don't need a malva and you have witnesses, you know that the receipt is valid, you could assume that it was paid and that it is valid, even though you find it amongst the documents of the malva. So my answer is no. We changed the word slightly from Yiskayim Birchesamav to Yiskayim Michesamav. We ask the witnesses, was this used or not? You signed on it. Did you see, was this loan repaid or not? If they say it was paid, then we can assume that we can trust the receipt. Otherwise, we have to assume that the Malva wrote it and did not ever actually use it. Next, the Gemara brings us from a brisa that says that a receipt that has witnesses on it is kosher. So you see that it's got witnesses, you could assume that it's valid, even if it's found amongst the papers of the Malva. So Gemara says witnesses here means not witnesses that signed that it's not forged. It means witnesses that signed that the signatures on it were validated. If signatures were validated, then that shows it was brought to court and the court ascertained that it was used, meaning that the loan really was repaid. That's the only circumstances in which they'll validate it, and therefore you could assume that it was paid off, and that's why there's validation signatures on it. Now this has to be the Pshat, the Gemara says, because if it was referring to the essential witnesses, and look at the Sefer. The Sefer says if it has no signatures, then it's puzzle. Obviously, if it has no signatures, it's puzzle. It must mean that if there's no signatures of the validators, then it's puzzle. That's a chiddush. That even though it has the main signatures, if it hasn't been validated, you assume that it wasn't used. Now, that concludes that sugya, but the Gemara briefly goes into the brisa we just quoted. Brisa says a receipt that has witnesses on it, which Rashi explains, as we said before, means witnesses that certify that the signatures are valid. Then you can collect with it, even if it's found amongst the papers of the Malva. If it's not certified, but it's in possession of a third party, not the Leva and not the Malva, you can also collect with it. You can also assume that it is valid, that is, which means you can't collect the loan, because if the Malva, who is the only one who writes receipts, put it in possession of a third party, he must have trusted that it was already paid off, and he trusted the third one, and therefore he would not release it if not for the fact that it was already paid off. The third halacha is if the receipt is written on the bottom of the actual shtar chayiv. That is, you had the loan document itself, and then that is signed, and in the margin under that, it says this shtar has been already paid, the money's been received by the Malva. That you can also assume actually was paid off, no matter who's holding it, because the Malva would not allow that to be written on his shtar chayiv, if not for the fact that it was true. To write a receipt and not use it could be, but to actually write on the original shtar that he's holding, which is his only tool to collect, would not write that unless it was actually received.